Now, the topic for the overarching theme of this week's conference, of course, is U.S. economic policy over the last 50, 60 years. And I drew the short straw to talk about Jimmy Carter. Except I want to begin by paraphrasing Jimmy Carter by saying it's time we got over our inordinate fear of reconsidering Jimmy Carter. Y'all remember I said we got to get over inordinate fear of communism. I'm not going to talk about foreign policy tonight, but that was the first indication that he was going to be a dunderhead in foreign policy. It's because conservatives don't want to think about him much. That was a long time ago, and it was really unpleasant. And liberals don't either much, except when it's useful for them as a club. So President Carter deservedly gets low marks for the performance of the economy during his one term in office. But with the lengthening of time, I think we can make out a more complicated picture with some ironies and contradictions and some legacies that affect us still today. And it's now, we're 49 years since his election in 1976. So there's several aspects of his time in office that have some distinct echoes. Now, I do want to put things in a little bit of a broader context to contemplate his rise. I think you could say in one sentence that the verdict of the 1972 election from the American people was, that government is best which McGoverns least. I stole that line from Stan Evans, if you remember. Stan, a frequent guest to Hillsdale many years ago. The problem was McGovern captured the heart and soul of the Democratic Party and has held it ever since, but he did not capture the heart and soul of a majority of American voters. So therein was the problem for Jimmy Carter, an ambitious politician, and therefore let us give credit where credit is due. Carter went from Jimmy Who at 1% of the polls at the beginning of the 1976 campaign season to being inaugurated as the 39th president in the space of 18 months. And his political strategy was a thing of genius. I mean, his obscurity prior to 1976 was, I think, confirmed most vividly when he went in 1973 when he was governor of Georgia on the TV game show, What's My Line? Some of you may remember this who are my demographic, right? He stumped the panel, which not only didn't recognize him, but failed to guess that he was a governor. Yeah, this is 3 years before he's president. George Gallup drew up a list in early or middle of 1975 of 38 possible Democratic candidates for president. Carter's name was not on the list. The Washington Post, in a 1972 story about Democrats who were rising, called him Governor Jimmy Collins. Couldn't even get his name right. And there's more. I've got lots of quotes and receipts of reporters saying it was a ludicrous proposition that this person could be governor. We had not elected a Southerner as president since 1848 with Virginian Zachary Taylor. And yet Carter figured out how to do it. His central insight was that after the disastrous and scandal-plagued presidencies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, what American voters most wanted in our bicentennial year was someone who taught Sunday school. And lo and behold, that's what the Southern Baptist Jimmy Carter did every week in his local church. He prominently advertised his status as a born-again Protestant Christian at the very time when Protestant evangelicalism was enjoying a significant surge in popularity and enthusiasm in the mid-70s. And it made a significant difference on Election Day. Carter, on Election Day, it was a very close election. I mean, a shift of just, we think about these last few elections as being close in the Electoral College, and it was, 50.5 to 48.8, something like that. A shift of only about 20,000 votes in 2 or 3 states would have delivered the Electoral College to Ford. So the things we've heard about of Florida 2000 and 2020 and 2016, not that unique for us. But Carter had a 25% margin over President Ford among evangelical voters. And since the Civil War, evangelicals had never given a majority of their votes to Democratic candidates once. Now, typical of evangelical enthusiasm, for example, was the Reverend Lou Sheldon, who I got to know pretty well in the 80s. He was nationally famous in the 80s for his very conservative traditional values coalition. But in 1976, he said, and I quote him here, "God has his hand upon Jimmy Carter to run for president. He's moving in the will of God." And Pat Robertson took his very young at that point 700 Club down to Plains, Georgia to tape a very laudatory episode with the born-again governor of Georgia. Of course, Pat Robertson from a Democratic family in Virginia, as we know. But the point is a lot of evangelicals, conservative in a sort of small c social way, they thought this was their person. There was a Newsweek cover story in 1975 or 76 called Born Again. And Newsweek said this: "Carter's dramatic capture of the presidential nomination has already focused national attention on the most significant and overlooked religious phenomenon of the 70s, the emergence of evangelical Christianity into a position of respect, and power." I'll just say that maybe the last time that evangelical Christians would be treated with respect or described as something deserving of respect in the national media. Carter told his fellow Baptists, quote, "There's no doubt in my mind that my campaign for the presidency is what God wants me to do." And then one of the things he said a lot in a standard stump speech was, "If I had to sum up in one word what this campaign is about, that word would be faith. The American people want to have faith in their government." One of the prominent political reporters at the time, a guy named Richard Strout, kind of forgotten now, but a big name at the time, he said, "I don't know if the country's having a presidential election or a religious revival." Now just pause here and say, can you imagine a Democrat running for president today who would talk this way? As I think this is not a controversial statement. The data shows the Democratic Party is relentlessly secular today and overtly hostile to religious sentiment. And some of you who remember this campaign, one of Carter's stumbles in the fall campaign was telling Playboy magazine that he lusted after women in his heart, whereupon a young Bill Clinton said, "Aha, I see a pathway." Fellow Southern Baptist, right? Really, Clinton and Gore are the last two Southern Baptist candidates who had some accent. Remember, Clinton's big phrase was a new covenant with America, covenant, a biblical term, right? But after that, it's been, in fact, there's been stories about how Al Gore said, "I wanted to have some kind of faith-based initiative, and my party wouldn't let me." That's a quote in a book about the 2000 campaign. So that's one change from the Carter years. Another thing to observe about Carter is that he ran as an outsider. And that has become the most common successful tactic for presidential campaigns in both parties ever since. You run against Washington. He was very good at that. That ought to tell us something about broad dissatisfaction with the cross-section of Americans with our centralized government. But Carter claimed he was a conservative. He said, "My philosophy is," his words, "benevolent conservatism or enlightened conservatism." And even after he was elected, he would say, "I'm a very conservative Southern businessman by heritage." And you can see how this would be confusing for a lot of voters across the spectrum who were not for McGovern, not sure about the Republican Party after Nixon. But Carter's speeches in '76 were almost indistinguishable from the other leading candidate, state governor, Ronald Reagan. So here's Reagan in 1976 in his standard stump speech. Quote, "Our nation's capital has become the seat of a buddy system that functions for its own benefit, increasingly insensitive to the needs of the American worker who supports it with his taxes. Today, it's difficult to find leaders who are independent of the forces that have brought us our problems: the Congress, the bureaucracy, the lobbyists, big business, and big labor." Here's Jimmy Carter's stump speech in that same campaign. "The people of the country feel they've been betrayed. The competence of government is not an accepted characteristic anymore. No matter what a person hopes to do ultimately in life, no matter what his top hope or aspiration may be, he feels generally that Washington is an obstacle to the realization of that hope." Other Carter themes. He talked about how the income tax, and he used that sort of Southern inflection, the income tax was a disgrace to the human race. He said, "We ought to have welfare reform." He said, there ought to be, quoting him again, there ought to be a work incentive built in, and we should remove from the welfare rolls those people who can work full time. We should decentralize power, he also said. When there's a choice between government responsibility and private responsibility, we should always go with private responsibility. You know, Reagan could hardly have put that better himself. And in fact, Reagan and Carter on their campaign announcement speeches for 1976 both quoted the same Bible verse, 1 Corinthians 14:8. If the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle? So as you'll know, today, evangelical Protestants are, and actually regular church attenders, almost all denominations, are a solidly Republican voting bloc. And it was, I'm going to skip over this part of the story, but it was the betrayals of evangelical Christians in the Carter administration that contributed most significantly to the shift in that voting bloc. That's a longer political story. I'm going to get to economics here as quickly as I can, starting with Carter's promise in the campaign to balance the budget by the end of his first term. And attached to that was a pledge that he would approve of no new spending programs that were incompatible with that. Now, his own party didn't believe him. You know, what good's being a Democrat if you can't spend money? And they were shocked when he tried to live up to this pledge in his first months in office. So it was barely a month into his administration. I should pause here to say that Carter had enormous majorities in Congress. You know, I think a 125 vote margin in the House and 62 senators. So it could break a filibuster easily. But a month into office, he threatened to veto a public works bill unless a whole bunch of pork barrel water projects were removed from it. He was right about that, by the way. They were pork barrel bills that should be struck from the bill, but he had no consultation with members of Congress, no negotiations. His relations with his own party were terrible, and it really upset his own party. And then this continued. They thought, oh my God, he really does want to balance the budget. So a few things from the media of that time. Robert Shokin of the LA Times, very liberal reporter, he said, many liberals in his own party complain that he is the most conservative Democratic president since Grover Cleveland. And the dean of liberal intellectuals, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., said, he's a Republican. He has the temperament of a small businessman who happened to become president. That was not a compliment from Schlesinger. And Carter initially relished this discomfort he caused his own party. He told one of his confidants after a meeting, quote, I wish you could have seen the stricken expressions on the faces of those Democratic leaders when I was talking about balancing the budget, right? When his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Joe Califano, a veteran of the Johnson Great Society, came back to him with a welfare reform proposal that would have cost billions of dollars more. After Carter saying, no spending increases, but let's reform welfare, Carter exploded at him and said, are you telling me there is no way to improve on the present system except by spending billions of dollars? In that case, to hell with it, we're wasting our time. And that was the end of it. But the big one was his refusal to introduce Ted Kennedy's comprehensive national health insurance plan, which has been the holy grail of liberal Democrats forever and still is, since that grail presented to us by Obama has so obviously crumbled. And so all they got from Jimmy Carter, finally in 1979, was a very bureaucratic hospital cost containment plan. And it was just as bureaucratic as it sounds, and it failed miserably in Congress right away. Now, even the Republican House leader, John Rhodes, at the time said, the president sounds so Republican, I'm overwhelmed. Now, this didn't last, of course, and it didn't last because stagflation took hold. You know, stagflation, that was, rising unemployment and rising inflation at the same time, which was not supposed to happen according to the reigning doctrine of Keynesian economics. And so he began then to surrender to the big spenders in Congress, and the budget deficit, which he had held down a little bit the first couple of years, started soaring again and doubled by the time 1980 rolled around from when he took office. I think what this really displayed was the decay of liberal economic ideology. And Here, Carter was at a real disadvantage. It was the one topic which he admitted he had no background in. He tried during the transition period to read a textbook on economics, which is probably not a good way to go about it. And over the course of his single term, his administration had 7 different economic programs, about one every 6 months. They shifted course many times, and they didn't really explain the rationale of them very well. And then meanwhile, to capture a temper of the times and give you some interesting hints of the confusion that I'll try and unravel at the very end, one of the big initiatives of congressional Democrats in those years was something called the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Bill. Now, eventually passed the bill that you actually hear every 6 months the Federal Reserve chairperson has to give the Humphrey-Hawkins testimony. It's kind of pro forma. There's these sort of goals out there, but it's not binding. The original bill said that the obligation of the Federal Reserve and the federal government was to achieve 3% unemployment, probably below a natural rate if you know anything about the natural rate of unemployment debates, and beyond that, guarantee a job for any worker, a job from the government for any worker who couldn't find a private sector job. And the original draft included a clause allowing a worker to sue the federal government if they did not find or create a job for that person. Would have been fun for the trial bar, right? That was too much even for the AFL-CIO. Felix Rohatyn, the famous economist from the time, a Democrat, he's the guy who bailed out New York City from its troubles. He said, this is the first step towards state planning of the economy, which it was. And interestingly, there was a freshman senator from Delaware you may have heard of named Joe Biden, who opposed the Humphrey-Hawkins bill, even in its final weakened down form, because he said the bill, quoting Joe Biden here, wasn't cognizant of the limited, finite ability of government to deal with people's problems. Where did that guy go? I'm not done with him, by the way. Stick around. But the problem was inflation was a blind spot of liberalism in the 60s and especially the 70s. Carter encouraged the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates by expanding the money supply. He appointed William Miller, a very compliant Fed chairman who did just that. And the money supply had already been growing at a rate of 11% a year when he took office. That's a rate that monetary economists were telling you then was too high, but people hadn't yet absorbed the significance of Milton Friedman's Nobel Prize in 1976. But a lot of liberal economists said, this is no problem. One of Carter's chief economists, Lawrence Klein, said, we need faster monetary growth. Government programs to stimulate the economy do not need to contribute to inflation. Time magazine said, the government should pump out as much money as might be needed to keep interest rates stable, meaning low, right? So inflation rose from 7% in 1977 to 9% in 78. The dollar began declining in international markets. And Carter said when inflation reached 9% that it was, see if this doesn't sound a little familiar from recent years, a temporary aberration. Now, the new word was transitory here 3 years ago, as we know. The polls showed that Americans now thought inflation was the most important national problem. And Carter, ever the moralist, said inflation was a problem, a moral problem of the American people. Among things he said was, it is a myth that the government itself can stop inflation. Rather, inflation was a reflection of, I'll quote him again here, unpleasant facts about ourselves, of our preoccupation with self, that diminishes the willingness of Americans to sacrifice for the common good. By the way, they created a thing called the White House Council on Wage and Price Stability, Council on Wage and Price Stability, and some wag said, the acronym for that is cow pies, which is perfect when you think about it. Ronald Reagan, by the way, abolished cow pies the first afternoon he was in office in 1981. But the head of that is a guy named Barry Bosworth, very prominent at the time, and he said, quote, if the government has any part to play in fighting inflation, it must have a role in private wage and price decisions. So we're back to government commanding the decisions of, okay, you get the point there. Now, To his credit, Carter did finally get religion on this subject, and by the summer of 1979, by which point inflation had reached 12% and looked to be going higher, the prime rate reached 20%. He got rid of William Miller and installed Paul Volcker, who clamped down finally on the money supply, but everyone knew that was going to be a painful problem to solve, and it took several years, as it always does. Now, the next humiliation for Carter was tax policy. Remember how he said the tax code was a disgrace to the human race? He wanted tax reform. What he produced was a mess. Higher taxes on people above median income. He proposed actually higher capital gains taxes. He suggested that maybe tax reform should involve abolishing the mortgage interest deduction for homeowners. Most of these ideas were not popular, even in a Democratic Congress. He did have one sensible idea in the campaign, which he repeated as president. We ought to get rid of double taxation of dividends. You know, we tax corporations with income tax, and then we tax your dividends when you get them from the company. Carter said we should get rid of that. So did George W. Bush in 2003, and yet we still have it. The point is, Carter actually was promising to deliver us a more steeply progressive tax code. And it was about this time, as many of you know, and I think we're going to hear about it in greater detail from Steve Moore tomorrow, that Jack Kemp and Delaware Senator William Roth came along with the Kemp-Roth tax cut proposal of cutting income tax rates. But they had an initial proposal to cut the capital gains tax in half. The capital gains tax in 1978 was 49%. 49%. I go through the math of this with students sometimes, and I'm not going to do it now. I don't have a chalkboard, and it gets into numbers in a hurry. But if you have 10, 11, 12% inflation, and you make a 10% return over 2 years on an investment, and they take half of it, it means you have lost the real value of your money and paid taxes for that privilege. So not surprising, nowadays we're used to venture capital like crazy and startups like crazy. And that dried up. This was the very earliest days of Silicon Valley, but it all stopped. And so it was proposed, the Steiger Amendment it was called, to cut the capital gains tax in half in 1978, and Carter threatened to veto it. House Speaker Tip O'Neill did everything he could to block it, but it passed the House by a vote of 362 to 49 in October of 1978, right before the midterm elections. Similar margin in the Senate. One of the yes votes to cut the capital gains tax came from Joe Biden. Somebody guessed it, right? So Carter dropped his plan to veto it. And guess what happened? Capital gains tax receipts immediately went up sharply, as the supply-siders predicted. And there was a 15-fold increase in capital formation in the 2 years following that cut. So, the net result of Carter's erratic economic policies were high inflation, slow productivity growth, stagnant personal incomes, persistent unemployment. And it was the death rattle of Keynesianism and the Phillips curve. And that wasn't even his biggest policy disaster. That came in energy policy. And it also involves one of the most bizarre speeches in presidential history. This requires a little bit of context, because I think, by the way, we're at the very end of a sort of long historical cycle, literally in real time in the last 10 days. But this requires some context. One thing to know about energy policy is it has been a bipartisan failure of both parties going back 60 years or longer. One of the things, and you have a little sympathy for Carter, President Nixon gave us wage and price controls in 1971, and they phased out, except in energy, where they were kept in place as a result of the first oil shocks from the Middle East starting in 1973. And so you had all these free marketeers in the Nixon-Ford administration who were gung-ho for allocation controls and price controls and all kinds of quotas and all kinds of crazy ideas. But Carter found ways to make it worse. And his approach to energy needs to be understood in the context of the growing popularity then of the limits to growth. Some of you probably know the story. There was a famous book, The Limits to Growth, in 1972. The population bomb a few years earlier by Paul Ehrlich, who I've baited twice in comical circumstances. And the gloomy argument was, we're running out of everything, we're running out of resources, and we're all going to die from pollution. Which will happen first? Doom all the way down. Now, this was all nonsense, but the idea of the limits to growth remained a core concept of environmentalism and then liberalism. For some reason, the liberal mind finds gloom exhilarating. Jimmy Carter, in his inaugural address, said, quote, "We have learned that more is not necessarily better, that even our great nation has recognized limits." Now pause here and remember that whatever else you may say about American reform liberalism, or however you want to describe it, it was historically an optimistic creed. And having open doubts about growth and the future of humanity has been a disaster for liberalism. There's some liberals today who finally understand this. They're slow learners, but they do learn. So in the space of a decade, or a little more than a decade, the central governing challenge of liberalism had gone from allocating abundance, that was Kennedy's growth liberalism, to rationing scarcity. So the contradictory embrace that liberals have for old-time government activism and the limits to growth ideology led to the incoherence of Carter's energy policy. Actually, I will plug this in now. I said that we may have been the end of this cycle. So you may have seen the news. Just 4 or 5 days ago, Bill Gates came out and said, there is no climate crisis. Let's get real. He's always actually been pretty sensible about energy technology because, he knows a few things about technology. But then you also have these so-called abundance liberals, and they're all saying, gosh, we overregulate things, and it's like, it's retarding prosperity. It's really hurting the middle class. And that's where I also say, good to see slow learners. How many decades have we been saying this? I had a review of Ezra Klein's book that got all his attention, and make the note that he seems oblivious to decades of scholarship from scholars, many of whom have been here to Hillsdale, like George Stigler, Milton Friedman, Robert Ellickson. I can go on a long list of people who've done extensive work about the deadweight losses of our regulation of housing and everything else. And these guys come along in the year 2025 and act like they've discovered this for the first time. And I'm glad they discovered it, but it makes me cross, because they might actually listen to somebody else besides their buddies in Brooklyn. Okay, end of rant. But my prediction is we're going to hear fewer, they won't disappear, we're going to hear fewer Democrats using the phrase climate crisis from now on, and more things like that. It's been a long time coming, but I think it has finally arrived. But back to Carter. Okay, the energy crisis, we didn't have the climate crisis yet, but we had the national crisis of energy. It was a national catastrophe. And Carter said, we must face the fact that the energy shortage is permanent. And we have to commit ourselves to the moral equivalent of war. Again, giving you the acronym MEOW. Fits perfectly, right? But, he said American lifestyles have to be scaled back, right? He came up with an energy bill that it was the size of 4 New York City telephone books. So you can just guess what was in it. I'm going to skip over a lot of the details because I'm going to run out of time and I want to leave some time for questions. Couple of simple propositions. What the energy market in America most needed was deregulation, removing price controls and allocation controls. A few people around Carter kind of sort of got that. And Carter in the campaign, typical of the way he campaigned, told people in Oklahoma and Texas he was for decontrolling natural gas prices, and he told people in New England that he was for keeping natural gas price controls. One reason for that is in Texas in the late 70s, there was a great bumper sticker that said, drive fast, freeze a Yankee. Right? Because that's where the gas came from, and you're going to sell it to those people, but the prices were controlled. We got the Department of Energy from Carter, which still produces no energy. Just to put a little bow on this, one of the last things Carter did before he left office in 1980 was to produce this phone book-sized report called Global 2000. And it was the same gloom and doom. By the year 2000, so the great thing about this was it gave you a date certain, which is now 25 years ago. And when 2000 rolled around, I went through and did a whole balance sheet of the whole thing. And almost all the predictions were wrong, most of them by an order of magnitude. So, for instance, the report confidently predicted that by the year 2000, the world would be short of oil by 20 million barrels a day, and that the price of oil would be $100 in inflation-adjusted terms. In 2000, the inflation-adjusted price was about $7 a barrel, backdated to 1980. It said there'd be shortages in food production and other basic raw materials, and all these things were completely wrong. I'll just skip over right now. But then, one of my favorite hangovers from all this is all the environmentalists in the 80s who loved this report and said, President Reagan is ignoring this report, to which we all say, thank goodness he did. And then the other one, this one still gets me. Part of Carter's symbolism was putting some solar panels on the White House. It was out on part of the West Wing, you can still find stories about this, about the histories of energy and all that. And they say, isn't it terrible? This just shows you how evil Reagan was. He took down the solar panels. Well, they never bothered to check. He took the solar panels down in 1986. They weren't photovoltaics generating electrons. They were these old solar panels you used to heat water, which is pretty useless a lot of the time in Washington in the winter, and they were leaking. But the way environmentalists still react about this, you would have thought Reagan was building a White House ballroom or something. It's just amazing. All right, as I said, with all this in energy policy, look, I'm an old energy policy wonk. I could bore you in a hurry with all the fine points, and I won't. It gets very technical in a hurry. Let me summarize by sharing with you one paragraph from a White House report from 1979. It was called Competitive Considerations and Government Commercialization Projects. So the government was going to give us all this new energy gizmos. Bear with me to the last sentence, because where the punchline is. The first assumption for any commercialization project by the government is that the market either has failed or will fail to make the optimum choice. It may be a failure in selection, that is, the market will not select the proper process or product. Or it may be a failure in timing, that is, the market will not make its choice at the proper time, will not commercialize soon enough. In either case, the basic presumption is that the government policymaker can make a better selection than can the market. Behold the quality of mind running the country's energy policy in the late 1970s. Unfortunately, we're still stuck with some of that legacy. The one thing that did pass that still sort of rules today in some very bad ways was it was called PURPA, Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act. It was the most significant piece of legislation affecting utilities since the Public Utility Holding Act of the New Deal era. And summarizing very shortly, it required utilities to buy power from independent power producers, especially wind and solar projects that were now enjoying big tax breaks and subsidies from the government. It tilted the entire playing field away, especially from nuclear power. And then states added on their own, it's called renewable portfolio standards, mandating that utilities must buy from these providers. Now, you may know that utility rates have been soaring here in the last few years. There's a report out just about 10 days ago from some old pals of mine up at Berkeley, and they looked at rising electricity rates. They did all the usual regression mumbo jumbo, and they said, they tried to disguise what they were saying, but what we read between the lines, what they were really saying was, the states with the highest electricity rates are the ones that have these renewable portfolio standards mandating wind and solar power. The states that don't have those, a lot of them have a lot of wind and solar power, but there the markets drove the decision and not politics. Now, anyone could have told them that in 1978, but we're still living under that regime. Trump is cutting away at some of it, which is good, but there we are. But now comes the footnote. Oh, I got to really rush here to the end. That wasn't the last part of the energy story. In 1979, many of you here are old enough to remember this. We had another oil shortage, entirely artificial because of government regulation, but a temporary disruption of the global market because of the Iranian Revolution. So here in America, and the students who are here won't believe this, but we had gas lines, long gas lines. Sometimes you'd have to wait in line in the morning. You get up at 4:35 in the morning, get in line, and wait an hour to get, maybe if you're lucky, 10 gallons, because most gas stations closed by 10 or 11 in the afternoon, or they were going to run out of gas and wouldn't get any more for a week. There were even some riots over this. And in the midst of this, Carter says, well, I got to do something about this. And he said, I'm going to give another big speech. He'd given 5 or 6 Oval Office addresses on energy, and they all landed with a thud. So he's preparing a speech, and suddenly he cancels the speech, and he disappears. He goes to Camp David for 2.5 weeks. And the media's saying, what are you doing? And I'm going to skip over. Some of this is a very funny story. It was just really kind of absurd, including Carter sort of inviting all these gurus up, none of them energy experts, but lots of social thinkers and all the rest of that. He was sitting around cross-legged on the floor. There are persistent rumors he was having a nervous breakdown, which I can't entirely rule out. He finally came down, and on July 15th of 1979 gave what has become known in history as the famous Malaise speech. And he said, I'm going to paraphrase here, I've got long quotes I'm going to skip over in the interest of time. He said, I know I'm supposed to talk to you tonight about energy, but I want to talk about something more serious, and it's the crisis of confidence in America. And he said it's inevitable that we have to have a lower standard of living. The crisis of confidence was the phrase he kept using over and over again. I'm going to skip over all that. You can look it up on YouTube. To use the famous line of Yogi Berra, you have to see it not to believe it. I show it to students sometimes, and their jaws usually drop. A couple things, and then he finally came in at the end and said, but we're going to do a few things about energy. We're going to have strict quotas on imports, which of course were never followed. And then he said, take public transportation. Park your car 1 extra day a week. Here's a quote. Every act of energy conservation like this is more than just common sense. I tell you, it is an act of patriotism. Okay. Now, one thing to note about the speech is he never actually used the word Malaise in it. And what happened is that his very interesting pollster, Pat Goodell, had used the phrase in a lot of preparatory material. His press secretary was asked the question, so is the president saying that the country's facing some kind of malaise? He said, yeah, you could say that, and that's how it stuck to the speech. Fans of the TV show The Simpsons may remember the scene from 1990 with the statue of Jimmy Carter with the label at the pedestal, Malaise forever. I've always thought that was how it stuck in popular culture. There's more to be said. I gotta say something about deregulation. Here's the plus side of Carter's ledger after all this confusion and nonsense. He did deregulate a lot of industries quite boldly, especially transportation. Airplanes, airlines, and trucking. I have a lot of fun telling students about this, but really, if you want to understand when airline deregulation became inevitable, it became inevitable when Southwest Airlines in Texas, exempt from federal regulation because they only started out in Texas, was offering flights from Dallas to San Antonio for $12. I got to interview Herb Kelleher about 40 years ago now, who was the founder of it. And he said, our competition wasn't the other airlines, it was Greyhound. And the light bulb went off that why are we still have the federal government setting airfares and regulating who can even enter the market to fly passengers on interstate routes? And curiously, no, I'll skip over that. The other thing that's important, and Doug Jeffrey will be cross with me if I don't mention it, is Jimmy Carter, as a Southern Baptist, was a teetotaler. He scandalized Washington when, Tip O'Neill would come over in the evening to talk to the president and would be given orange juice. And his first state dinner, he didn't serve any wine. And yet, he deregulated beer. I don't know if you know the trends on this. I sometimes show this chart to people too, is beer was dominated by Schludwiller, as I used to call the big three of beer, Schludwiller. And there were only 75 breweries in America by 1978. Now I don't think we can count them now because there's thousands, right? Exactly, thousands. He deregulated beer. And why the teetotaler gave us this, I'm not sure, but it's something to celebrate, one of the positive aspects of Carter. It's a big story because it carried on. It really began, the deregulatory sentiment began in the Nixon Ford years Carter pushed it forward, and then Reagan really pushed into overdrive. That's an important thing to say, especially on energy prices. Reagan decontrolled energy, oil prices on day one. Other areas, not so much. Carter's Federal Trade Commission tried to harass the cereal makers for the sin of offering consumers too many choices. I'm not making this up. That was dropped on day one by Reagan. The important point here is that what you saw in the 70s was a slow transition, still not finished, from economic regulation, regulating basic markets like transportation and energy ultimately, to social regulation. You know, the EPA and the environment, the Consumer Product Safety Commission and so forth. And Carter and his people loved all that. They wanted to create a cabinet-level Department of Consumer Affairs. That was Ralph Nader's wish list, right? I think then to draw to a close and leave some time to questions, I think now the lessons we take away is that Carter was this transitional figure. Remember I began by saying that McGovern had captured the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. Carter, who wanted to be McGovern's running mate in '72, desperately, by the way, but didn't get it because he was so ambitious. He was a transitional figure trying to bring the party back a little bit, the way Bill Clinton did a little bit to the center. And the problem was the Democratic Party was moving very fast to the left and they didn't like it. And so he was bound to fail. He not only angered, he angered his entire party. He became an albatross for the Democratic Party. But the other thing that was said about Carter is, and I've skipped over all this, in his campaign he was very vague on the issues, or as I mentioned a couple examples, contradictory. And in fact, he ran on a personal image campaign. One of his campaign strategists said, voters are more likely to be inclined to someone who stresses their personal qualities, of integrity and confidence. And it shows up that on election day, his own pollsters said that 50% of the voters still don't know where Carter stands on the issues. In other words, be vague. There's a harsher version of this, which is, what's that great Charles Krauthammer line? What's a Democrat, Daddy? Daddy says to his kid, it's a socialist with a filter. That filter seems to have sort of eroded and fallen apart lately. But the point is that's become a template now for successful Democratic presidential candidates, especially, I think you'd say, Obama, right? Hope and change. Hope and change for what? Well, it was very vague about things, right? And that's now their template. And he was the ideal foil, you might say, for Ronald Reagan, who, as I say, looked at what Carter did and reversed as much as he could by executive order on day one and day two, and we know the rest of that story. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take some questions or comments or whatever. I guess we have microphones here at the front, and people are supposed to get up and come up. Is that what we're going to do? Right, yeah.
Thank you. We have time for Q&A. Please make your way down to a microphone. Student questions.
It's just like a classroom. Nobody ever wants to ask the first question, so I usually plant one with somebody, and that opens the dam.
Thank you very much for your speech, sir. My question was kind of simple, but I felt it was very good to clarify. You said President Carter was talking a lot about monetary responsibility and balancing the budget before the pressures of stagflation got to him. And so I was wondering if there was basically any evidence, any actions that he did that actually showed what he was promising before the stagflation, like in the sense that, is that something he actually wanted to do, or do you think he was forced by the pressures to just do something to stop the stagflation?
I think, so let me restate it this way. I think there was the growing crisis in conventional Keynesian economic thought throughout the 70s. And by the time you got to 1979, there was almost nobody, there were a few true believers, but nobody really thought the old view, which I didn't explain, maybe Amity did earlier, I don't know, is, there used to be thought, if we have high unemployment, we'll just have some inflation and it'll bring it down, or if we have high inflation, we'll just raise unemployment. That was destroyed in the 70s. It was called the Phillips curve. It first shifted way to the right, which meant you got both. And then next, all the sort of Keynesian big spending formulas didn't seem to work. And the supply-siders came along with a very compelling argument that even as I mentioned Joe Biden, but there are a lot of other Democrats who said, you know, that does make sense. In high inflation, we are taxing investment too highly. And then finally, inflation was so high that I think opinion changed. And somebody, I'm not sure who it was. If I ever knew, I've forgotten. I should delve back into it. But by '79, someone said, we need somebody tough at the Federal Reserve who is going to rein in the money supply. It's going to mean a lot of pain, and that's when they brought Paul Volcker in. So I think it was changing circumstances and the collapse of the reigning sort of liberal model of how the economy works. They'd been so confident of this in the 60s. We can fine-tune the economy. Well, the fine-tuning knob was broken. And he finally figured that out. I mean, Carter may have been a very odd guy in a lot of ways, but he wasn't dumb, and he could figure some stuff out. I'll do another student, okay.
Hello, sir. My name is Vito Gabriel. I'm a freshman here. My question is, it kind of relates with national debt and the inflation. As right now, I believe we're at $36 trillion in debt. And this past summer, I went to Italy, and I was trading in my money, and when I went to trade in the American dollar, they gave me a significantly less amount than what I thought. And when I came back to America, I traded the euro in, and I got a significantly more amount. And so my question is, with the inflation and the national debt, is there any way we can, I guess, recover the value of the dollar and, I guess, build its value back up?
So I'm going to punt a little bit and say you should ask that question tomorrow to Steve Moore, who will have a better answer than I can, because I'm a political scientist, not an economist. I'll just say, well, the dollar's had a very bad year this year. You picked the wrong summer to go anywhere in Europe where the euro is. I'll just say that. Whether it's going to get better, I don't know. It's rallied the last week or two, but look, I wouldn't make a long-term bet on the dollar right now, because that debt is so gigantic. I'm so old, I like to say now, I can say now, but I remember when it was a shock when the first federal budget, when Reagan was in office, was 86, I'm going to say, reached $1 trillion. Was it 89? 89, okay, but it was, right, and now it's, what is it, 10, I forget, 10 trillion, it's ridiculous. And the national debt, I don't remember, but it was, what was that? Oh, 38 now. What was it in the mid-'80s? I don't remember. It was only, 4, I forget now, but we're on a runaway train here. And I think it might have reached $1 trillion. I don't remember now. I don't keep those figures in my head. Steve Moore will know. Or maybe Amity knows. But so I'm going to punt on that, though. We want to.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us, Dr. Hayward. I just had a question. Like we mentioned a little bit how statesmen like Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Joseph Biden all spoke a little bit about their personal faith and made allusions to the Bible. Was this a strategic political move to gain the Christian vote, or were they truly sincere about their faith?
Oh, that's a good question, and I'm going to half punt here, because you can't peer in another man's soul and know for sure. We're all sinners and hypocrites. So, Bill Clinton, faithful Southern Baptist, kind of hard to make out. Okay. In Carter's case, he, just what you'd observe from afar and things he said and things he's written, it looks like he was a pretty seriously devout Christian. And I do think, and I know people from the time who were saying, I made very brief mention in my talk that in the mid-'70s there was a real explosion is not too strong a term of evangelical enthusiasm in this country. I think Carter saw that. He was the perfect candidate for it. I think Reagan considered himself a born-again Christian, but he thought Carter wore it on his sleeve too much and wanted to be more reserved about it. Because Reagan was he was a Presbyterian, but a faithful churchgoer in LA when he was a private citizen. So I think a lot of politicians said, oh, this country's having a bit of a religious revival. And by the way, in those days, the Democratic Party was not hostile to religion. And that was also an important fact. So I think Carter was certainly sincere. As you go from there, it starts to a little harder to credit, I think. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You live and work in liberal land, Berkeley.
Well, yeah,
I've had family there for years, and we're kind of at odds. But I do not understand using the term liberal.
Oh,
Why can't
Yeah.
we start calling what people really are leftists, or what would be a better term than liberal? Because that's
Yeah.
what this place is.
Correct.
Because we take facts and make decisions.
yeah.
We don't just go, oh, it'll feel good.
No, that's a huge problem, and I get this question a lot. I thought about it a lot. So yeah, look, the first person who started corrupting the word liberal from its classical liberal meanings in America and elsewhere is Woodrow Wilson. So this has been a century long, and then of course Franklin Roosevelt does it more. They stole the word liberal and they made it, sort of soft socialist, social democratic. I did think that Hillary Clinton was onto something when in 2007, I should back up a step. Remember that Reagan especially was really good at demonizing the word liberal. Michael Dukakis said, I'm not a liberal, I'm just a competent technocrat. Remember, the issue of this campaign is not ideology, it's competence. Everyone knew he was trying to dodge his own quote unquote liberal record. Hillary Clinton in 2007 says, I'm not a liberal, I'm a progressive. And I thought, now we're getting somewhere. And I wish they would, it's a real problem. I've been talking to people for 30 years about, could we reclaim the word liberal for what it originally meant? And I'm afraid it's a lost cause. Maybe I shouldn't give in so easily. I'll just say a couple things that are fun is American students, at least the ones I encountered, Hillsdale students are probably smarter than this, but they're baffled when I point out that the free market conservative parties in Australia and New Zealand and in Eastern Europe in their native languages are always the liberal party. And Americans do, what? They don't, this is news, and they don't get it. And Eastern Europeans, students that I've had a few times over the years, this is back 20 years ago when I was teaching briefly at Georgetown, they'd say, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, they're not liberals, they're socialists. They understood that distinction. I wish we could get it back. It's hard to do. Right now, I kind of like using a dual purpose, which is to say, he's a liberal, and then also attack people on the left for saying you're illiberal, which is really what they are, quite illiberal in many ways. And so maybe the cognitive dissonance that could be generated from that is a little bit useful. I wish I had a better answer, but I don't. Yeah.
We now have time for one more question.
Okay. I'll talk to you afterwards.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak. I am curious to hear your thoughts on if it's possible to balance the budget without causing some pretty substantial economic disruption. If you were to get rid of Social Security to get a third of the deficit down, you'd disrupt small town America and leave seniors in a super bad position. And you never get elected again, obviously, so it wouldn't happen. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so once again, you should pose that question to someone who's got much more economic depth than I do. I know enough to think that if something becomes necessary, it becomes possible. So then the question becomes somewhat technical, and what's the transition period going to be? How are you going to phase this in? So shock therapy can work in Argentina, maybe in Russia and a few other places. Here it'd be hard to see, but we're going to have to do something. And the longer we wait, the worse it's going to be and the harder it's going to be. I think that's not a controversial thing to say. But yeah, I think it has to be done at some point. And it's just going to be a matter of how rough it's going to be. And I'm an old Reaganite optimist. We'll get through it. Could be bad, but we'll get through it. And I'm an old guy, right? And it's going to be, you're going to bear a lot of the brunt of it and have to clean up our messes that my generation created. Oh, what a cheery note to end on. But good luck to you.